Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin comes out and is an immediate hit. 3,000 copies sell on that first day. It soon sells out its complete first run. Uncle Tom's Cabin has basically, since that moment, kind of been in the American canon. Many of us have read it in high school or college. But we want to focus a little bit on that initial moment of release because while it was a big hit, as you can imagine, it was also very contentious. Some booksellers were attacked for carrying the book. There was a whole slew of counter books that were written in its wake. So here to discuss what came to be known as America's most cussed and discussed novel are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there. I love a good play.
I know. I need more rhyming epithets.
Cussed and discussed. But let's talk about book sales. 3,000 copies in one day, really big for that time. I think probably still very big.
Still pretty big.
Yes. I was going to say even today, though, that's not nothing.
So why is it? Why is it primed to take off in this way?
I mean, during the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century, Americans have an insatiable appetite for literature, for reading. You know, most people in this period only sort of have access to the Bible and your local paper maybe. So when you get like a big bestseller like this, it takes off like wildfire. And the fact that she's writing about something that is controversial. So it's not just, a romantic novel or something like that, but she's telling the story in which you get the first time a Black person is a main character, a central character of the story. I mean, it's named Uncle Tom's Cabin. And people on both sides of the aisle are going to be up in arms about this book. Abolitionists, love it. They praise it. Southerners, they hate it. They disdain it. And, anytime you have controversy, you have sales.
And the pump had been primed for this book for a good year before it came out, because before it was a book, this was a serialized story that ran in an abolitionist newspaper, the Nationalist Era. And it would come out week after week after week. I think she was initially commissioned to have 3 or 4 installments. She ends up with more than 40. And it's so popular that the newspaper gets inundated with complaints anytime there's an issue that comes out that doesn't include a new part of the story from Stowe. So there were people who were already so excited about this story, and to now have it come out as a novel was even better.
We definitely don't need to do plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin or even, kind of the impact of the actual content of the book. But, well, first off, Kellie, do you teach it still, or have you taught it?
I don't think I've ever taught it. Yeah, but that's fine. Because when I'm teaching my classes, I think it's important to read, history, not fiction. That doesn't mean fiction doesn't matter. I'm just saying history I think is more important. And I think it's more important to read the actual experiences from enslaved people. So we definitely read Frederick Douglass's narrative or Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl. That's a constant on my syllabus. Yeah. But that's part of the issue of the book, too, is that a lot of Black abolitionist leaders were like, listen, she's making money hand over fist over our stories, over stories that she has no connection with. Just a lot of sympathy and empathy. But these are not. Is this really her story to tell? I think is a better question than anything else.
And so I think, for context there, she's a white woman who lives in Brunswick, Maine. In the years before this, I think had housed a fugitive slave. It is the Fugitive Slave Act 1850 that really seems to animate her. And I think there's kind of a family member who basically says look, if you care about this stuff, get off your ass and do something. And you're a good writer. How about putting pen to paper? So she does have a little bit of fire under her to get these issues out.
But she's also very open about the fact that she is taking these stories from the accounts of people who had escaped enslavement in the South. In fact, she publishes a book after Uncle Tom's Cabin called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is kind of a collection of the stories of people who had escaped to freedom as a way of showing, look, it's not even just that I made all of this up, but that I'm actually essentially fictionalizing the stories of all of these people who had escaped to freedom.
She does a lot for the abolitionist movement. Like, I mean, we can look back in a contemporary moment and be like, hey, you know, enslaved people can speak for themselves. But in that moment, not a lot of them could. I mean, it was still difficult to get published. It was still difficult to even tell your story in a way that did not affect sort of the sensibilities of white people. They didn't want all of the graphic details of, you know, whippings or rape. And so the way she's able to tell this story, fiction as it is still so powerful for the cause in terms of like tugging at people's heartstrings, that it does a lot of damage. You know, there's the sort of somewhat apocryphal story of Lincoln meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe and saying like, are you the little lady that started this war? You know, sort of like giving her the nod that like this book sparked, you know, a civil war.
Yeah.
And when we think about that impact, it's not just that she is a white woman writing this story in the very kind of like maudlin, sentimental style of the day, but she comes from a really famous family. She's the daughter of Lyman Beecher, who is this hugely famous Congregationalist minister. And I think that gives her kind of a purchase and cachet as well. Like, not just is she this white woman from the North, but she's like this famous white woman from this famous family who's writing the story.
Yeah, I mean, and it just gets at this question of who has access to telling stories in the first place and who the audience is. And, you know, we talked about this when we did the Harriet Jacobs episode, where that was a direct narrative of a formerly enslaved person, but that had to be, for lack of a better word, laundered through a sort of white white newspaper, you know, in order to reach the right audience in the right ways.
And people didn't really know that Harriet Jacobs wrote the book.
Yeah.
For it was, you know, she had like a pseudonym basically attached to her name.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So back to kind of how successful this book is. I mean, 300,000 copies of the book are sold the year after it comes out. 8 printing presses. So listen to this. Picture this. There are 8 printing presses running constantly in like a room to keep up with the demand. For apparently a 3-month period, she received $10,000 in royalties. I haven't done that math, but that is a lot of money for a 3-month period. No surprise, there was backlash. So, you know, one remarkable incident was in a bookseller in Mobile, Alabama, was forced out of town for selling the novel. And people obviously were sending threatening letters to Stowe. There was a package sent to her containing a slave's severed ear, apparently.
Oh, gosh.
Just, you know, intense backlash.
Yeah, vile. Yeah. I mean, it's also intense backlash from the Black community. Martin Delany, another famous Black abolitionist, was not a fan of what she was doing. He basically said that she was borrowing and profiting off the stories of enslaved people. To give you some scope, so her book sells 300,000 copies in the first year. Frederick Douglass's book sells 30,000 copies in the first year. Now, 30,000 copies is still a lot of books, but when you think about how much more could have been sold and the money that's being made, it's not great. And then Martin Delany also talked about the fact he was not a fan of her support for colonization, like the idea of sending Black people to Africa, and the idea that maybe like a free Black person was not compatible or difficult to reconcile in America or in the United States. There's a lot to chew on, good and bad and benign, and, you know, with this book.
And you've indicated this, Jody, but there was also like intense opposition from the South. And that should come as no surprise, that this kind of anti-slavery even abolitionist tract would be it would be banned in the South during this period. But there were also, because people understood the power of narrative and how much this book had the potential to change people's minds about slavery, that you get all of these books that are being published by writers who are pro-slavery to try to like do the same thing but for the pro-slavery side. So there's a book called The Sword and the Distaff by William Gilmore Simms, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin by Mary Henderson Eastman, The Planter's Northern Bride, like all of these books that are meant to be kind of the counter argument to this novel.
I just love, like, I'm going to write a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's going to be, going to take it right to her. I'm going to call it The Sword and the Distaff. Like, it's just, at some basic level, it's just like, come on, buddy. Like, no one's going to read The Sword and the Distaff. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a good name, you know?
It is. You want to know what's going on in that cabinet. I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It just, what's mind-boggling to me, though, is that, like, fast forward 200 years or fast forward almost 200 years, and, like, the idea of book banning always around like topics of race or gender, like these things are old issues. We think about what's happening in our current context, and it's like we've been doing this for a very, very long time, and with very, very similar issues, and it's just wild to me.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, there's also this whole really fascinating and sort of convoluted thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin as like IP and copyright. It like, came out at a moment where copyright law was sort of being shifted and contested, and there were all these, like, I think sort of maneuverings and shenanigans, both because like the publisher shuts down, the initial publisher shuts down, and then she ends up dying, and there's all these like questions about putting out new editions and so forth, because just to sort of put a capper on it, this is the second best-selling book of that century other than the Bible. So, there is a lot at stake in who owns the rights to this book, but it's pretty remarkable.
It also is one of those books that has, as we've talked about, gone through a lot of reevaluation over time. But I was really struck by this George Orwell essay that he writes in 1945 called Good Bad Books. And he says in the essay, the supreme example of the good bad book is Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is, he calls it ludicrous, full of preposterous melodramatic incidents. But then he says it is also deeply moving and essentially true. It's hard to say which quality outweighs the other. And that idea of being both ludicrous and laughable, but resonating on such a deeply emotional and moral level is, I think, what makes it still a book worth understanding, if not being read in relation to a bunch of other books.
Can I say, one of my friends is writing a book about how book bannings, and she said that in the Black community, they had questioned whether or not they should ban certain books, like Little Sambo and all of this stuff, really racist books. And they came to the conclusion, no, we shouldn't ban these books. And part of the rationale behind not banning it was, one, it's a record of the racism that did exist, and they didn't want to whitewash like the racism of the time. But also, like, there's so much to grapple with. Even bad books, like, teach valuable lessons. So, I always teach Birth of a Nation in my slavery and film class because the film is so terrible, but also because the film is so useful in understanding the world that people lived in 1915.
Yeah, well, that's a great note to end it on. Very resonant to this moment now. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.